And good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking your time, whether you're here with us live or if you may be listening to this later on in the recording, for taking a look at RiteSoft Solutions. Yvette's exactly right. We're going to take a look at two products today. We'll start with our riteSCAN system. That's our mobile warehouse solution for SYSPRO, and that's the screen that you're looking at right now. riteSCAN is built as an extension of SYSPRO itself. It's built exclusively to work with SYSPRO, and it essentially takes the power and the warehouse management capabilities that you have in SYSPRO and extends it out into the hands of the people who are in the right place at the right time with the right information about your transactions so that those can be entered in immediately as those transactions are happening. riteSCAN uses SYSPRO's business objects as a means of connecting to SYSPRO. Now, I don't mean to jump into the technical side of things right away. That simply means that all riteSCAN has to do is capture the information about the transaction and then hand it over to SYSPRO. SYSPRO takes care of making sure that your proper SQL tables or your CISAM files get updated accordingly, and all of your settings in SYSPRO, all of the business rules that you've defined, which warehouses if you use multiple bins or if you don't allow your warehouses to go negative, any and all of those settings that you've taken time to get just right for your organization, all of those settings are in play when you're working with riteSCAN. And that's because riteSCAN never touches your data in SYSPRO directly. We always hand the transaction to SYSPRO, and then SYSPRO makes sure that the transaction is okay and in accordance with the rules that you have established. So riteSCAN really has a real-time, full-time connection to SYSPRO. It's always connected to SYSPRO. And one of the easy ways to show that is to just start by doing an inventory query. You can see here on my screen we have nice big bright icons for each of our functions. Again, there's a little method to that process. We want to make sure that it's easy for that end user who may be in a darker corner of the warehouse or might be outside under the bright sun where there may be some glare off the screen. We don't want them having to search through a teeny tiny menu or look for a stylus to select the item. When they're interested in doing an inventory query, they can just touch the icon, and that will take them in, now in my case, to the inventory query screen. And you can see on here I can either scan, and you'll hear the beeps as I scan my barcode. I can scan one of my SYSPRO stock codes, or I can, if I have a keyboard on my device, I can key that stock code in. And what riteSCAN will do is simply do a query to SYSPRO, and in a matter of a couple of seconds, I see on my screen all of the inventory data just as if I were sitting at a full SYSPRO workstation. You can see the gray bar there at the top gives me the brief description of the item I scanned in so I can remember what I scanned. And then I have two tables of data. The top one showing all of the quantities for every warehouse where this particular item is stocked. So again, you can see the on-hand and available quantities. I can scroll across if I need to see quantities allocated to work in process or if I have some on order. And again, these totals, because it's a real-time connection, these totals are exactly the same as I would see real-time in SYSPRO itself. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see there's another table for those of you who may use multiple bins in SYSPRO. We show you those bin totals right on the same screen, so you don't have to do a secondary query for that. And again, that would show you all of the appropriate bin quantities, whether on hand and available or if it's on hold for whatever reason, all of that information would be present there. So not only is the inventory query a great way to show the real-time connection between riteSCAN and SYSPRO, but it's also a useful tool. We've had some of our riteSCAN users say that inventory query, now because it's in their hand as they're walking around the warehouse, is a powerful way to keep them in touch with what SYSPRO says they have on hand. If you notice something in the warehouse on the stacks that seems a little out of order, you can check right away and see if SYSPRO has that up to date or if there may be a potential problem in terms of the accuracy. But usually, when most people want to do an inventory query with riteSCAN, they're in the middle of doing some other transaction. For example, they might be doing a Pio Receipt, and they want to decide which bin to put it in, which bin has the most room based on what quantity it currently has. And so for that reason, in every function in riteSCAN, we have access to the inventory query right without leaving the function. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to touch the warehouse transfer icon. And right next to that stock code field, you'll notice that there's a little mini icon that's exactly the same inventory query icon. What that means is that as I'm doing this transaction, if for whatever reason I need to check the inventory data for that item, I can just touch the little icon right next to the stock code field. And in a second, we'll be right back at that same screen that we were on just a moment ago with all the same totals that we were seeing there. The advantage here, of course, is that I'm looking at that in the context of the transaction I'm doing. Once I see the total I want and I get the answer I need, I can touch OK, and it takes me right back to the transaction I was working on. I don't lose any data. In fact, I'm right back on exactly the same field that I left when I went into the inventory query screen. So that's available in every function in riteSCAN so that that information's at your fingertips as you're working with the tool. All right. Let's move some inventory around. We're going to start here with a warehouse transfer. You can see across the top of the screen that riteSCAN has support for immediate transfers as well as transfers out and transfers in. And then all of the rest of the fields on the screen, as again, if you're familiar with this transaction in SYSPRO, they're going to look very familiar to you. And so we can capture that information either by entering it using the keyboard, or anything on the screen can be scanned. So if your barcode label has a quantity on it, you can scan that quantity just like I scanned the stock code. And then, of course, now moving from one warehouse to another, we need to identify our warehouses. But before I do that, I want to draw your attention to the fact that there are a number of fields on the screen that are currently grayed out. You'll notice that, for example, the lot field or the bin fields are grayed out currently, not allowing me to do any entry. Well, this is another example of how riteSCAN uses its real-time connection to SYSPRO to make things easier for the end user. SYSPRO has this wealth of knowledge about our inventory. It knows if we have items that are lot traceable, or if a particular item is under serialized control or under ECC control, or if a warehouse happens to have multiple bins turned on or not. SYSPRO has all of that knowledge. riteSCAN leverages that knowledge to make things easy for the end user by graying out a field that would be optional until it's time that for the particular transaction you're working on, until it's needed for that particular transaction. What I mean by that is this. If I scan a warehouse that happens to be multiple bin, as most of mine are, you'll notice that the bin field now becomes open and available and ready for me to enter that particular piece of information. So if I'm the end user, I don't have to remember which of my warehouses are multiple bins and which are not. SYSPRO knows all of that, and riteSCAN will only open the field when it's necessary based on the setting inside SYSPRO. In the same way, if a stock code happens to be lot traceable, as soon as you scan the stock code in, the lot field would become available, or the serials field would become available in the sense where the item is under serial control. Same thing will happen here for my destination warehouse. When I scan that warehouse, the bin field becomes available. I'll scan a bin in there as well. The last two fields here on the screen, reference and note, are standard SYSPRO fields, and you may notice that I already have answers in those two fields. I have a default response in those two fields. riteSCAN has an administration tool that allows you to set certain settings or configuration items that are particular to riteSCAN. And these are two good examples. We can set default responses for our reference and note field so that the user doesn't have to enter them each time. Often people will use them for kind of the examples that you see here, either to indicate that these transactions happen with riteSCAN as opposed to in SYSPRO, or they may want to indicate the employee's ID. Maybe it's an employee number or initials or just a username. So again, that information flows through and they're able to use it in the reporting and so forth that they do. The riteSCAN administration tool allows you to set these settings either across the board for all users or all the way down to the individual user level. Once I've got my information that I need for the transaction, I can touch the post button there in the lower left-hand corner. riteSCAN packages it up, sends it over SYSPRO, and if everything's in order, I'll get my message there at the bottom of the screen that says post successful. So as an end user, I know that this transaction now succeeded and it happened. It's in SYSPRO. So if whether somebody is running a SYSPRO report or looking at a query, or in fact, if another riteSCAN user is somewhere else in the plant and wants to issue an item to a job or perform some other transaction, the result of this transfer that I just completed is in SYSPRO. And that post-successful message also tells me that everything was in place according to SYSPRO's rules. I mentioned at the outset how riteSCAN uses SYSPRO's business objects. And In the same way that if in SYSPRO I tried to transfer an item to a warehouse where it doesn't belong, where it's not normally stocked, or if I tried to transfer a quantity that I don't have, if I'm not allowed to take that warehouse negative, SYSPRO is going to prevent me from doing those transactions. Well, riteSCAN will prevent exactly the same way. You're not going to be able to do a transaction in riteSCAN if SYSPRO wouldn't let you do it. And that's, again, because we use SYSPRO's business objects to complete that. All right, I'll touch my OK button there in the corner, and we'll go back out to the main screen. You'll notice at the bottom we have a variety of tabs down there. We're on the Inventory tab currently, and we just completed a warehouse transfer. You can see by looking at the icons on the screen, you'll recognize, no doubt, many of the common inventory movements that you're used to doing in SYSPRO. Bin transfers, for those of you who use multiple bins. Quantity adjustments, both an expense issue and a miscellaneous receipt. So again, many of the quantity movements associated with inventory. I'd like to spend just a minute or two here looking at the stock take function. I'm sure that some of you use SYSPRO stock take either for your annual physical inventory or perhaps for a regular cycle counting program that you might do, or periodic spot checks and so forth. Well, when I go into the stock take in riteSCAN, the stock take here, of course, is integrated fully to SYSPRO's stock take process. And again, those of you who are familiar with SYSPRO stock take, you know that the first step in SYSPRO is to go select which warehouses you're going to be counting and to identify which items within that warehouse you're going to be counting, whether it's a full count or maybe, again, spot check or a cycle count. The portion we have here in riteSCAN is the portion that makes sense to be walking around the warehouse, the counting portion. So after we've defined our stock take in SYSPRO, instead of printing up a bunch of sheets or tickets or what have you and sending folks out into the warehouse with clipboards to do their counts, I can send them out with their riteSCAN handheld. And then when they get to the spot where they want to count, they can scan that warehouse in, scan in the bin if you're using multiple bins, scan or enter the stock code as appropriate, and then they do their count. And they whatever the total is, if there were 83 items, they enter that in. I just used the keyboard on my device to enter that quantity, and then they touch post. And here's where the efficiency happens. When you see that post successful message, of course, that means the transaction is done and in SYSPRO. Now, of course, here we're in the stock take function, so that data has gone into the stock take tables inside SYSPRO. It's not touching inventory yet. That post-successful message, though, means that that data is there, and if I'm the one who's running the stock take, I can already start to put it to use. SYSPRO has a variety of good standard reports that it has available in the stock take function. A good example is an uncounted items report. SYSPRO will show you how many items have been counted or how many are remaining to be counted. And of course, if you're waiting for that item to, those clipboards to come back in, you really don't have any sense for what their progress is until the data comes back into your office. With a tool like riteSCAN that has a real-time integration to SYSPRO, that data is coming in immediately, and so now that standard report in SYSPRO of an uncounted items report also becomes a progress report. You can run it to see how people are doing because that data is coming in real time as they're doing each of their counts. Of course, you can also use the variance reporting and so forth in SYSPRO to see if there are any large variances that you want to tackle right away, even while people are still doing their counting. A lot of times, stock take is one of the very first functions that people put to use in riteSCAN, either because they do a full physical inventory once they bring it on board, or they're working to bring on some additional quantities or to clean things up. The stock take becomes a very efficient way to put riteSCAN to use and begin to achieve the return on your investment. Okay, let's pop back out to the main screen, and we'll move over to the next tab, which is the Orders tab. And you can see here on the Orders tab that we have another 4 functions. We have support for paying sales orders as well as receiving purchase orders. For those of you who might use SYSPRO's goods in transit functionality, you can see that riteSCAN has support for doing both in and out functions for the goods in transit operation. We're going to start with a Pio receipt. Let's bring something in on the loading dock. So I'll touch my big crate there in the center. And now you'll see the screen that is used for riteSCAN to receive in a PO. Right at the top, it wants to know my purchase order number. So if I have that in a barcode, I can scan it. if I have a printed PO with a barcode on it, for example, or if my supplier's been trained to put a label on the outside of the container that has my PO number on it, I could either scan it if it's a barcode or key it in and so on. But what you saw as I was describing that is riteSCAN did a quick query to SYSPRO to make sure that that PO number, in my case 462, is a valid PO. Now, I know I have a valid PO for a couple of reasons. First of all, I didn't get an error message saying I couldn't find it. And secondly, you'll notice in the little blue text there right below the PO number, riteSCAN is showing me the supplier for that purchase order. So right away I can verify if I have the right PO by seeing, is this the right supplier? Who did the truck come from? That blue text is also an active hyperlink. So if I touch it, it's going to show me a little thumbnail description of the header of the PO. So again, if I need to, I can verify if I have the right item. Now, the simplest way to receive an item on a PO is just to go ahead and scan a stock code. And when I scan that stock code, it'll look it up on the purchase order. In my case, it found it on line number 7, and it's showing me what my outstanding quantity is. At the present time, there are 350 items outstanding against this particular line. I would then enter my quantity, enter my other identifying information, like in my case I need a bin. You may need a lot number depending on how the item is defined and so on. And then once I've got my data, I touch post. And then riteSCAN will receive that item either into inventory or into inspection, depending on how the item is defined in SYSPRO. Again, without the end user having to do anything different, they simply touch post, and riteSCAN performs the correct type of a receipt based on how the item is defined. Now, you'll notice my purchase order is still up there at the top, so I don't have to rescan that. We figure you might be doing more than one transaction for that PO. And if I go right back and scan that exact same item, it's not really a surprise that it found it again for me on line 7, but you'll notice that the outstanding quantity now has dropped to 340, so it's reflecting that receipt of 10 that I did just a moment ago. The important thing to know is that that didn't matter that I was the one that did that receipt. In other words, that outstanding quantity is a real-time query back to SYSPRO. So if there are 2 of us or more that are receiving in this same order, and someone across the loading dock happened to receive in another different quantity of, say, 20, while I was receiving in 10, my outstanding quantity here would show the reflection of both of those receipts. So again, it's a real-time query of what SYSPRO says we still have outstanding against that particular line. Now, a couple of questions that often come up here when doing purchase order receiving are the following. I scanned my stock code, it found it on the line number, that's great. But, sometimes we have purchase orders where the same item is listed on more than one line. What happens then? Well, the good news is that riteSCAN doesn't guess. We would allow you to enter in the line number if you knew that line number and wanted to supply that. But sometimes you don't know what that line number is, or maybe you just want to see the items that are on the purchase order, or there's no barcode available. It'd be nice if I could see a list that I could just pick from. Well, in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, you'll see that there's a button there that says View Order. As I touch that button, riteSCAN will show me a list of all the merchandise lines that are on this PO. So if I happen to have the same item on more than one line, I can look through my list, or if I just want to say, you know what, I want to receive that one, I can just touch the item on the screen that I want to receive, and then I touch the Pick button down in the corner, and everything about that line then flows onto the main screen so that I'm ready to complete my receipt, just as you saw me do before. Another question that often comes up here is related to, as I mentioned, the supplier putting a label on the outside that has our information. Well, we can't always get that to happen, but quite often the supplier's container does have a bunch of barcode labels on the outside. The problem is those barcodes don't mean anything to us. They're not our stock code. They're the supplier's part number or SKU or catalog number or whatever they call it. It would sure be nice if there was a way I could scan their barcode and receive it in correctly into SYSPRO as my SYSPRO stock code. Well, with riteSCAN, that's possible. Let me show you. Here in the stock code field, I'm going to enter in, and I'm going to do this one by hand, I'm going to enter in a ZZ100. I'm doing it by hand because, frankly, if I do it with a barcode, it goes by so fast I don't get a chance to describe it. But having entered in the ZZ100, First thing you need to know is that I do not have a SYSPRO stock code that matches a ZZ100. So when I hit enter on this, or if I scanned it as a barcode, riteSCAN will first check with SYSPRO to see if it's a stock code. That's going to fail. But I have riteSCAN set up to go looking in other places in SYSPRO for a match. I'll explain where those other places are in just a minute. If it looks into one of those other places and it finds a match for this ZZ100, riteSCAN will convert it to the matching SYSPRO stock code, and then it'll go ahead with the rest of the process. It'll look that stock code up on the PO, see what line it's on, see what the outstanding quantity is. Again, just as if I had scanned my SYSPRO stock code, instead I'm scanning my supplier's barcode. So here on the stock code field with my ZZ100, now watch what happens as I hit enter. You'll see that it thought there for a second while it was looking up for a match. It found a match and converted it to an A100, which is one of my SYSPRO stock codes. And you'll see that it found it then on line 1 of this particular PO and what my outstanding quantity is and so on. And just to show you again, if I go back up here to the stock code, if I scan it in as a barcode, it works exactly the same way. Now, how does this happen? Well, SYSPRO has a number of places where you might put this kind of an alternate identifier, and riteSCAN can go looking in those places. One of the common places that people will use is in the inventory master file. There's a spot called the alternate key 1 field. That's often used for folks who have like UPC codes or an alternate identifier that has a one-to-one relationship with the underlying stock code. But for a situation like this on Pio receiving, oftentimes this A100 part might be something we buy from maybe 3 different suppliers. Well, in SYSPRO, there is a supplier stock code cross-reference table that allows me to define, say, for example, for supplier A, they call this part the ZZ100. For supplier B, they call it something else, and supplier C, they call it yet again something else. So for each supplier that I buy it from, I can actually enter that information into SYSPRO in a standard SYSPRO table, and riteSCAN can go looking in there for a match. There's also a corresponding table in SYSPRO on the customer side. If you do private labeling or have different IDs for certain customers, you can define a different identifier on a customer-by-customer basis. And also a lot of folks will use a table in SYSPRO called the approved manufacturers list. And riteSCAN can also look in that table and find an appropriate match for you. So lots of places, and in fact some of you may already have some data in those tables because you use it for other purposes in SYSPRO. And riteSCAN can help you leverage that to make it easy for the folks to receive the item in. Okay. We'll move on now back out to our Orders tab, and we'll take the next look at the Sales Order Picking option. A lot of similarities here to the Purchase Order Receiving. They both start by scanning the order. Of course, in this case, it's my sales order, not my purchase order. And again, riteSCAN checked with SYSPRO to make sure that it was a current and active order. And I know that it is. Again, there in the blue text right below the order number. This time, of course, it's showing me my customer for that order. And the simplest way, just as we saw with purchase orders, is to scan an item that's on the order. And in this case, when I scan it, you'll notice that I have something turned on here in Sales Order Picking that I did not have turned on in purchase orders. You'll notice that it found it on line 2, and it shows me right next to it what the outstanding quantity is. But you'll notice that that quantity now has defaulted in to my actual quantity field, so that all I have left to do is scan the bin, and I'm ready, and I've picked that particular line. Now, some folks like this function because it saves them time. They don't have to enter that quantity in on each and every transaction. It simply defaults in the quantity for them, and they can move on to the next item. Some folks hate that because they want to make sure that the user is physically entering the actual quantity every time they're doing a transaction. They don't want it to just guess or just take whatever the default quantity is. And that's why we give you that choice. Going back to earlier when we were talking about the riteSCAN administration tool, this is exactly the kind of thing that you can set inside the admin tool so that riteSCAN works the way you want it to work. And you can set it across the board for all users, or again, this can even be set down to the individual user level if you need it to function differently for different users. I'll scan my bin here, touch post, and now we've picked that particular line. Again, just as with purchase orders, we see that there is a view order button here on the screen. So if I don't have that maybe a delivery note or a picking list in front of me and I want to actually look at the sales order, I can touch that view order button and it will show me all the merchant lines that are on the sales order, so I know what to pick. I can select the item that I want to pick, touch the pick button, and again, all of the data will flow through onto the main screen, scan my bin, post that through, and I've picked my line items for this particular sales order. So again, very similar process to what we saw with POs. Of course, here we're picking our inventory to send it out the door instead of the other way around. All right, we've got one more tab we're going to take a look at here today, and that is the manufacturing tab. And the manufacturing tab, as I bring it up, you can see we have a variety of different functions here. For those of you who may use the back flushing option in SYSPRO, you might recognize that as the same item here. We have it here on the manufacturing tab. Usually that's when most folks will use that, but it's the same standard inventory movement that you would do inside SYSPRO. Also across the top, you can see we can receive items in at the end of a job. We can issue materials directly to a job. And then we have some other icons below that. We've recently added kit issues to riteSCAN on user request so that we can now do more than just issue a single line item or single material allocation at a time. You can do a full kit issue, including standard labor if appropriate. And we have a WIP locator function next to that, which is a little bit of a departure for us. It's really our first function that does something that SYSPRO doesn't really do on its own. It's a great way for users who need to keep track of partially finished items that aren't really inventory, but might need to get stored somewhere in the warehouse temporarily. The last icon on the bottom of the screen is the labor post icon. You may note that it's a little bit different than the other ones. It's currently grayed out. The version that we are demonstrating here today, our current version, the labor post function has not yet been released, but that is something that is in the version that is coming out. We're working on testing that right now, so that will be out and available, and that icon will light up when you're a riteSCAN user, and you'd be able to take full advantage of that function as well. We'll take a look just at a couple of the functions here before we turn things over to riteTIME. The job receipt, we'll just take a quick look at that. You'll notice that this looks very much like a Pio Receipt process. Of course, in this case, we'd start by scanning the job number, but then you'd supply your quantity and other identifying information, bin or lot number and so on, and then as you post that through, riteSCAN will do the receipt in the inventory, or again, if it's an inspectable item, it'll receive it into WIP inspection for you. Let's take a little bit of a look at job issue. As I select job issue, we'll scan the job number here. And riteSCAN will check with SYSPRO again to make sure that that's a current and active job. It'll show me what that job is slated to make there at the top. And if I have a printed out job traveler that's got the barcodes on it that I can scan those. Or if I don't have that in front of me and I just want to see a list of the material allocations, we have our View Job button here, just as we had the View Order button on the earlier examples. Touching View Job will show me all of the material allocations for this particular job as it sits in SYSPRO. And if I just need to review that information, I can do that. Or if I want to actually touch one and touch the Select button, I've now selected that particular item for issuing to this job. So we're really doing the equivalent to a specific issue in SYSPRO, an issue of materials against the job. And then you specify your quantity as appropriate, bin or lot, or again, any of the identifying information that you might need. Touch Post. And if everything's in order again, you will get our post successful message indicating that we have now issued that particular item to this job. And so again, I could go right down my list, go back to my View Job screen, and add additional or issue additional items to that job as appropriate. But we also had requests from folks who wanted to be able to do not one line at a time, but rather to be able to issue the full kit, issue all of the components in one step. So we added the kit issue function. I'll select the kit issue icon here in the middle of my screen. We'll enter in our job number in this case. And you'll notice there's a couple of differences here on the kit issue screen. First of all, right there below the job number towards the top, you'll see that the quantity for this job is 5. So apparently this job was built, set up to build 5 of these bicycles in this case. And then just to the right of that quantity, you'll see that it's indicating that we're currently looking at the first of 5 material allocations, first of 5 components for this particular job. And that information at the bottom of the screen then describes that item. You can see the stock code and the quantity required and so on. But I can use those arrows up there to go to the right and look at the second of the 5 components or the third of the 5 components. And I can scroll through these and either just review the data, or I can actually enter in if one of them happens to be lot controlled or one of them is serialized and I need to enter in that identifying information for each one of the components. I can do that. Or if I need to just change the kit quantity. Maybe we're only building 3 today and I only want to issue the materials for 3. I can change that quantity, and when I touch enter, riteSCAN will again check with SYSPRO, and SYSPRO will tell us how many of each of those components are required to build 3 of the items. So again, when we're not touching the data directly, we simply make the request of SYSPRO, and SYSPRO, just as it would in your in a standard system, will show us how many are required for each of those items. You can see my items down there at the bottom have now had their totals updated down to 3 based on my new kit quantity. And once you've got your identifying information in, you would simply touch Post. Post will go through, and if all of the appropriate quantities are in place, it'll issue all of those materials out to the job for all line items with a single post. And then, as I mentioned, you can also do standard labor. Again, just like SYSPRO, you could do a standard labor, and that's an optional choice for you in the riteSCAN administration tool. All right, we'll move back here to the main screen, and if you'll give me just a moment, we're going to switch things over now and take a look at riteTIME. We've been looking at riteSCAN, our mobile warehouse solution. Actually, you know what? I think there's one other thing I'll show here just before we switch over to riteTIME. I'm going to move my screen just to the right here. And on the left side of the screen, you'll see something that looks a whole lot like the one on the right. To this point, I've been doing my demonstration on a handheld device, very similar to the one that's pictured here on the right. You've been watching my screen. If I scroll up, you'll see that it does have a full keyboard, alpha and numeric, but there's a wide variety of different handheld devices that will run riteSCAN. So if you want one that has a little different style keyboard or a different form factor, again, there's a lot of different possibilities. As long as it's running Windows Mobile, we are compatible with Windows Mobile 5 and 6 and 6.5 and even all the way back to Windows Pocket PC 2003. So there are dozens of different devices that'll run riteSCAN. But you may also want to deploy riteSCAN on a PC. And so on the left-hand side of the screen here, you're seeing our Windows client for riteSCAN. And what that means is that I can run riteSCAN just on a regular workstation that I might already have in place. It might be on the loading dock. I can plug in a USB wedge scanner, and suddenly I have a riteSCAN workstation. Or if I have a workstation at the end of the manufacturing line that does job receipts, or if you have a cage where some materials are issued from, you probably already have a workstation in place so that folks can work with SYSPRO. Well, you can deploy riteSCAN there, and if all they're doing are basic riteSCAN functions, transfers, queries, Pio Receipts, whatever their function might be, they can be logged into riteSCAN on that machine. And here's the beauty, is if I'm logged into riteSCAN, even though I log in with my standard SYSPRO login name and password and company ID and so on, when I'm logged into riteSCAN, I am not using one of my standard SYSPRO seats. So you may be able to free up some seats that can be used for others who need more of the full power of SYSPRO on their desktop and deploy the riteSCAN on either their PC or on a handheld, depending on whether or not they have requirements for using for mobile. All the functions are the same on both the PC, of course, and the handheld, and all the screens gather the same information and process exactly the same way. In that regard, it becomes a wonderful training tool as well. You don't have to pull one of the handhelds off the floor just to do training. They'll be able to see that on the PC screen just as easily. Okay, now we're going to switch things over, and we'll move on to riteTIME. Give me just a second here. Okay. you should now be seeing my riteTIME screen, and we're shifting gears here a little bit to a different product. riteSCAN, as you saw, all deals with inventory stuff, moving inventory around, whether it's receiving it in on the loading dock, moving it around from place to place in our warehouse, or making transactions in SYSPRO related to the manufacturing process, issuing to or receiving from jobs. riteTIME's focus is different. riteTIME's focus is on labor data collection. So how much time have I spent on a particular task today, whether it's an operation for a job, or it may be time for a meeting or a presentation that I had to attend. And riteTIME will help you capture all of that kind of information. riteTIME is also a little bit different from riteSCAN in that riteTIME has its own database. riteTIME works with a SQL database, which runs just fine in SQL Express, which is Microsoft's free version of SQL. We have a number of customers that are running it right with SQL Express. But there is a database behind the scenes, because with riteTIME, the data that you're capturing is not only useful in SYSPRO, but it may also be useful in other systems, perhaps a time and attendance system if you want to use some of the time clock functions of riteTIME. Or maybe you just want to integrate it to some other report or some other system that you might have that may make use of some of the data that you would be capturing with riteTIME, perhaps indirect tasks and so on. But let me show you how riteTIME will work. The screen we're looking at here is the one that most folks will often deploy out onto the floor for their frontline workers. And so a user would walk up to the screen and they would log in. I have mine set to show me a drop-down list of all my users here. You can also just uncheck a box, and what will happen is it'll all be set for them to walk up and swipe a badge or scan a badge if they use barcode badges and so on. And I'm going to log in here first as James Francis, and we'll pretend that James is just starting work for the day. He comes in and he wants to start working on his new job. You'll notice we do have time clock punches here. I'll say a little bit more about those in a minute or two. But we're going to go ahead and start a new job for James. So we'll touch the Start New Job icon. And then what riteTIME will do is ask a series of questions so that it knows what job he's going to work on. And again, these can easily be scanned from a barcode traveler, or if they don't have the barcodes in front of them, I can simply use the drop-down to select the job I want to work with. And then once I answer my first question for job, you'll see my list down here. It's currently going to ask me 3 questions for this job, the operation, and the work center. I'll select my operation, and I can select an appropriate work center. And then as soon as I've entered all of my information, because James is a user that I've defined that can only be logged into one job at a time, it logs him right out, and we're right at the back of the main screen. He can go to work, and riteTIME is ready for the next user to come up and log into their job. So time passes, and James eventually finishes his task, and he wants to come back and stop that job. He comes back and logs in again, either swiping his badge or, like in my case, selecting his name from the drop-down. And you can see that his screen has changed just a little bit. In addition to the Start icon, which was there before, you'll now see that he has a Stop icon. Next to that Stop icon is a job number. That's the job that he punched into, in our case, just a moment ago, but in the real world, it was probably an hour ago, something like that. Well, when he's ready to stop, he can touch this Stop icon, and then riteTIME can be set so that it will ask him for how many quantity pieces, how many items he completed, or if there were any scrap quantities, or what the reason for that scrap was, and so on. You can have it prompt for notes, or if none of that is pertinent to your operation, when he touches Stop, he's done. And now riteTIME has recorded both his start time and his stop time for that particular operation, so it can calculate how much time he spent on that operation, and it's now ready for sending over to SYSPRO for your job costing purposes so that you can apply that labor to that particular job. Now, in the real world, we probably don't want James just stopping that job and then sitting around waiting for the next one. He's switching. He's moving from one job to another all throughout the day. And riteTIME can handle that kind of transaction as well. Instead of having to come back and log in and do a separate start, let me log in here as a different user, as Justin. Justin's the same kind of user as James. He can only be in one job at a time, and he's right where James was just a moment ago. He's already logged into a particular job. As you can see, there's a Stop icon for him here. Well, if what Justin wants to do is switch from job A to job B, he doesn't have to hit Stop, come back, and start the second job. He can just touch Start New Job. And because riteTIME knows that Justin is a one-at-a-time user, it's showing him a message, essentially saying, hey, I'm going to have to stop your first job before you can start your next job. So he would say okay to that. And now it's going to ask him for the information about his next job. So we'll select the job, we'll select the operation, select the work center, and in one transaction, he's done both things. It stopped his first job, and by the way, it would ask any questions that you have set up to ask at closing time for that job, quantity again, or a notes field, whatever you may have set up, it would ask us those questions first, and then it went ahead, as you saw, and asked me the questions to start his next job. Now, you may have folks within your operation that work on more than one job at one time, and riteTIME is great for those users as well. Let me log in here as Sandy Cornfield. She's a little bit different. She's a more experienced user, does more jobs at one time. And so you can see her screen's got a little bit more going on. In addition to her Start New Job icon and her stop, right next to the stop field, you'll notice that instead of showing us what job she's working on, it's actually showing us that she has 2 current active jobs. So she's logged into 2 jobs already. But you know how it goes with busy people. They get in the next work, so we'll hit Start New Job here. And instead of what we saw with Justin, where it said I have to stop your current job before I can start the next one, it's going right to the spot where Sandy can log into a new job, because she can be in multiple jobs at one time. So let's pick job 160 down here in her operation and so on. Again, it's the same 3 questions, but once she's done, you'll notice that now her stop icon has increased to 3 active jobs. And so she could log into a 4th and to a 5th and so on, depending on what her needs might be. Now, perhaps that starting of a new job is actually taking the place of one of the ones that she was working on. Well, if she touches this stop icon, instead of stopping all 3 jobs, what riteTIME will do is show a list of the jobs that she's currently working on. So she can select which ones she wants to stop. If she is, in fact, stopping all, she can select all of them. Or if she's only picking one, she can select that one just by checking it, or 2, or whatever of her list she's going to be stopping. riteTIME will give her the option to divide that time equally across the jobs, or to give each job the full time. And then she touches OK. And now I'm back down to 2 active jobs. Again, it would prompt for any questions for quantities complete, scrap quantities, and so on if we had those turned on. But in our case, it stopped the job, and so now she's back down to 2. Let me talk a little bit about some of the other icons that we're seeing here on the screen. You'll notice there's a section up here towards the top that says time clock punches. riteTIME can be used to capture time clock information, as well as the job information that we've seen to this point, including, punching in for the day, going in and out for lunch, and at the end of the day as well. We also have a couple of icons that aren't turned on here for breaks. So if you want the user to punch in and out for break, those can be turned on. A couple of points here. First of all, that's fully configurable for you. So if you already have a time clock system and you don't want to use riteTIME for capturing that information, we can actually hide all of these icons on the screen so they don't show up, and so the users are never confused by them or never accidentally get some data in there that you don't want. Those icons just simply don't show up at all. But if you do want to use riteTIME to capture the time clock information, then again, you'll see the power of having a separate database for riteTIME behind the scenes. That data, which would have no use in SYSPRO, will definitely be useful in your time and attendance and payroll side of the world. And so depending on what kind of a payroll or time and attendance system you have, many of them will just receive the same kind of time clock punches here that riteTIME will gather, and you can transfer that information over to the we can integrate it for you to the payroll or time and attendance system that you have, and you're now using riteTIME for all of your data entry. In addition, looking now down towards the bottom of the screen, we have some other ways of tracking your time. Not everybody in the plant necessarily wants to use the start and stop function. That may be great out on the manufacturing floor, but we may have other workers whose time we need to capture for job costing. There may be engineers or designers or other professionals who work at their desk and are not going to run out to the floor and do a start and a stop, but they definitely put time towards a design or towards a refactoring or something like that that has to get costed into the job, and oftentimes that's a difficult thing to capture. Well, they can run riteTIME right from their desktop, and quite often what they will use is this function down here that says Direct Hours. Direct hours is very similar to a time card, where I can just simply say, maybe at the end of the day or at the end of my shift or whatever it might be, I can put in, I worked on this job today, this operation, and I put in an hour and a half. So instead of having to do a start and a stop, I can just simply enter in the time that I've put towards various jobs today. And here's how that works. As I touch direct hours, you'll see the first difference is that it actually pops up a date and time selection item for us. Now you've noticed that we've really geared riteTIME to work well with a touch screen environment. And this screen is another good example of that. Oftentimes the standard Windows date picker option is really pretty small, and if you're working on a touch screen, it can be difficult to select that. Well, we've kind of exploded things out here for our date and time selection so that it's very easy to select the date that you want, or if this happened at 9:30 this morning, I can touch 9:30 and I'm ready to go. So I enter my date and time here. Because I'm not doing a start and a stop, riteTIME wants to know when that transaction happened. Now we see our familiar questions, just as we saw before with the other transactions. What job are we working on? What operation? What work center? And so on. And now here's the other difference. In addition to knowing when it happened, because it doesn't have a separate start and a stop, it wants to know how much time we put towards that job. So I could say I put in an hour, and here I'm just using the keyboard on the screen. I can use an hour and a half, put in 1.5. Also worth noting is that people can enter their time either, as I've done here, in decimal hours, or if they are more comfortable entering it in hours and minutes, they can use the colon. And so 1 hour and 30 minutes is, of course, the same as 1.5 hours. And riteTIME will accept it either way and save it appropriately in its database. And now I've put that time towards that particular job without having to do two separate transactions to start my work and to stop my work. So it gives you that flexibility to deploy that as you see fit for users who may want to put their time in but won't be out on the floor using the start and stop transactions. Next to the direct hours, we also have an icon for indirect hours. And this is used to capture data for time that is spent not on a job. It may be maintenance time, or time in a meeting, or a training session, or shop cleanup, or watching a presentation online. That indirect hours option, when we select it, of course, it asks for a date and time too, just like we saw the direct hours did. But then instead of asking me my now familiar job questions, it's asking me for what kind of hours what did I spend my time doing for this particular posting. And this listing that you're seeing here, inventory, maintenance, and so on, this is a fully customizable listing. So you can have as many different items here as makes sense for you. You can have 5 like I have, or you can have 55 or 105, whatever is appropriate for your operation. And perhaps we were spending some time in a training, so I can select training from my list, and maybe it was an hour. And now I'm also showing in this example the notes field. And this is available for any transaction that you would do inside riteTIME. I just happen to have it turned on here only for my indirect transactions. And of course the notes field can be used for any kind of information I might need. So if it was an online presentation, I can put that in. And you'll also notice we have the keyboard here on the screen. Again, for those of you who might find a touch screen to be the most effective way for your operations, they can key it right in on the screen using the keyboard there. Of course, you can use a standard keyboard, PC keyboard to enter the information, or a mouse like I'm using. You don't have to have a touch screen, but it's geared for that for those that need it. Say OK to save that, and I've entered my indirect hours as well. Okay. Now, of course, riteTIME also has supervisory functions where a supervisor can make changes for an individual user, or see and even approve transactions that have been entered in, and then those transactions can get sent over to SYSPRO for the costing processes. So that's a quick overview for both riteSCAN and riteTIME. And now I think we'll take a look and see if there are any questions out there. A couple questions that often come up, and we'll handle those. And then Yvette, you can come on if there are any other questions that have come up. One of the questions that comes up with riteSCAN is, what are the hardware requirements, or what do I need to do to install it? With riteSCAN, As I mentioned, the hardware requirements for the handhelds, anything that runs Windows Mobile will run riteSCAN just fine. And on the PC client, of course, just a standard PC will work there. You don't need a separate server for riteSCAN. The riteSCAN web service just gets installed right on your SYSPRO application server, so you don't have to bring in any new box. Switching to riteTIME, as I mentioned, does have its own database, so you'll need to have a server that will host that database for you. You may not need to go get a new server for that process. As I mentioned, riteTIME works just fine with SQL Express. Certainly, if you have your SYSPRO data stored in SQL, you can certainly add your riteTIME database into that existing SQL instance. If you don't already have SQL in place, you can download and install SQL Express, again for free, onto any server that you might have if you've got a server with some capacity, and that can certainly house the riteTIME data as well as the riteTIME applications as well. Let's see. At this point, we'll open up the floor. Yvette, have any questions come in to this point?
Thank you, Richard. At this time,